Thank you for joining us for Tackling Inequalities through Geospatial Data. I'm Catherine Cheney, a senior reporter at Devex focused on technology and innovation in global development, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator. This is the third in our digital event series, Ensuring Progress on the SDGs through Geospatial Thinking and GIS Technology, which is produced by Devex in partnership with Esri. I'll start with a bit of context on our conversation today before introducing our speakers. So as we all know, COVID-19 has deepened already existing inequalities, hitting the poorest and most vulnerable communities the hardest. Addressing these growing inequalities will be key to not only achieving SDG 10, reducing inequality within and among countries, but also ensuring that no one is left behind as other goals are met. Geospatial technologies can be used to help identify gaps in progress on the Sustainable Development Goals and empower decision makers to course correct interventions in order to better target those most in need. However, despite an abundance of geospatial data, tools, and technologies that are readily available, access to reliable and consistent mapping, data, and analytics still remains out of reach for many low and middle income countries, including places that might benefit from these tools the most. So today we'll explore best practices in leveraging geospatial tools and technologies to mitigate different forms of inequality, and also how to close that geospatial data divide so that these tools can really realize their full potential. We'll start with a conversation with Charles Brigham, lead account manager for nonprofit and global organizations at Esri, before moving into a panel discussion. Charles, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Catherine.
Yeah, it's great to see you. So today we're focused on the role of geospatial data in making progress on SDG 10, as I mentioned earlier. And I wonder, people in our audience may be more or less familiar with specific use cases. But before we dive into the use cases, I wonder if you can just talk more broadly about how can geospatial tools and technologies be leveraged to mitigate different forms of inequality? Or in other words, why are geospatial technologies relevant and critical when we're talking about SDG 10?
Sure. So to address inequalities in general, we have to understand the human-environment relationship. The human-environment relationship is the discipline of the geography in and of itself. What geography attempts to do within its discipline is to look at the human-environment relationship. And looking at the human-environment relationship, there's a lot of ways to approach it. You use tools to derive and understand phenomena and derive findings from that phenomena. So using a tool such as GIS can help you advance that understanding of specific geographic phenomena. Now, GIS itself, by itself, is not going to solve the problem. You need to apply it to something. So what is where and why is it there? That's the question you're trying to answer. And within the spectrum of that answer, you're looking at different types of geography. There's inequalities across different types of geographic disciplines, if you may. If you look at social geography, if you look at economic geography, if you look at location analytics and information and context. So there's a wide array of inequalities within the spectrum of geography in and of itself. And the challenges to understand that human environment relationship are what we're trying to do in a wide scale effort across the support for our development users, development, international development.
Great, and I love that framing, what is where and why is it there? So you kind of talked about on a broad scale how geospatial tools are useful in making progress on SDG 10, but I would now love to go into some specific examples, and especially in low and middle income country contexts where there often is this geospatial digital divide. What are some specific examples you can share with us that really help us envision in a very clear terms the ways that GIS can help to reduce inequality, again, within and among countries?
Sure. So the easy one for us to all understand and absorb today would be the Johns Hopkins dashboard, the COVID dashboard. I think a lot of people have seen the COVID-19 dashboard by Johns Hopkins University to understand the global nature of coronavirus and the local nature of coronavirus. So that's something that I point people to understand how GIS and geography plays a role in tackling the bigger problem of, say, a global pandemic. But there's a lot of different applications to this specific geospatial tool that can be understood and explored through different lenses and the challenges that we face. So, for example, if we want to look at specific geography and inequality, we can obviously see now in the US the disparities among local communities on marginalized populations, minorities, and the challenges therein in terms of access to vaccines, COVID cases rising or falling. There's obviously inequalities spread within and among those geographies. At a global level, there's also different types of inequalities within the global context of COVID-19. You see countries that have less or more access to vaccines. You see countries that have no or minimal or lack of infrastructure for access to medical care, period, let alone resources and outreach and communication on COVID-19 for those populations. So there's multiple geographies we're dealing with here. In my work in Esri, serving our users, there's a lot of work going on in the COVID space. We have a COVID hub and many different ongoing activities. But in my past work in development, you can also see specific uses of GIS to tackle inequality. For example, looking at where midwives are within a specific country. How do you get those midwives the access they need to understand the challenges in young pregnant women in rural areas? How do they deal with those challenges? Well, you need to understand where the problems are. And to identify where the problems are, that may require more than technology has to offer. Going to those local villages, talking to those local populations, understanding the policy measures that need to be put in place to address these needs. But once you have that information, you can use tools like GIS to discover, use, make, and share information that provides those midwives greater access to those specific beneficiaries to get women the hospital care that they need. So there's a lot of different use cases and understanding of how inequality can be viewed, but it's an extremely critical SDG 10, reduced inequalities, to address and attack head on.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, COVID-19 has really brought the value of these tools to the forefront. And I think a lot of people who might not have known what GIS was pre-COVID, now, mapping and answering those critical questions you mentioned in terms of what is where and why is it there, that's part of the global conversation around COVID-19. And now we can hope that some of these same tools and some of that same global interest might extend to things like climate change, which is also a crisis that's really going to take over the globe and exacerbate inequalities, unfortunately. But geospatial tools can be part of addressing those problems. I want to zoom in on this challenge I mentioned earlier of the geospatial digital divide. Access to reliable and consistent mapping data and analytics, as I mentioned earlier, is really out of reach in a lot of these low resource settings. So what is being done to address this, and what more needs to be done?
Yeah, I mean, first, we want to provide some context to the audience, and maybe just sharing that the easy example, again, to understand might be flooding. Small island developing states may not have a flood warning system. In Western countries, we often have flood warning systems that allow us to understand how floods affect our communities. There are huge differences in the way that these challenges are addressed globally at the national level and at the subnational level. To address these issues, we need to understand where inequalities are taking place within a country. And to do that, the right technology infrastructures need to be put in place, the right access to those technology infrastructures need to be put in place, and the right businesses need to leverage these technologies to better serve their users across these different spaces to gain understanding about specific information that can become available to people in their everyday lives. So the way to do that is to provide solutions that everyone can use. And what we want to try to do in the efforts around development in general is to provide more information at the community level for people to make more informed decisions and have the dialogue between policymakers and individuals become more transparent so that we're talking to each other. And within that dialogue, identify the tools that will strengthen our ability to communicate with each other. And GIS provides a way to do that at the hyper-local level and at the global level.
Thank you. I want to ask you about one specific effort. So I know that earlier this year, Esri and other partners launched the SDG Data Alliance, which will create an SDG data hub for each of the 17 goals across developing nations in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And just for a bit more context, the release states, the data hubs will assist developing countries in measuring, monitoring, and reporting on their progress toward reducing inequality, and will empower people to ensure inclusiveness and equality. So I guess it seems like it's early days in this effort, but I wonder if you can just quickly tell us what steps have been taken so far, and are there any lessons that are emerging in terms of how these low resource settings really can use these tools to reduce inequalities within their own contexts?
Yeah, so what's really exciting and telling at this moment is that SDG 10 is if not the least addressed SDG, both in terms of finance and understanding. If you look at the voluntary national reviews across the UN system, you can clearly see the gap in the ability for countries and populations to address this issue. It's just not prevalent. And I would argue least popular among a lot of the SDGs, yet it's probably one of the most critical SDGs that are required for all other SDGs to succeed. So in sustainable development, we need a better understanding in general of inequality. And that's one of the things we want to bring into the SDG Data Alliance as we move through the process of supporting countries in monitoring and reporting on the SDGs, as you mentioned. So the SDG Data Alliance provides three things. It provides capacity, it provides technology, and it provides governance. All of those things are supported by the members of the SDG Data Alliance with resources, with expertise, and on the ground working with the countries and the different SDG stakeholders. So what we're trying to do is set up a plan alongside everyone that needs to be involved in the SDGs in a specific country. In that plan, we want to set up in process a capacity building program that can strengthen that plan over time till 2030, and technology that could support the implementation of that plan till 2030. And we've now achieved a quorum of countries that are extremely interested and engaged in this process, and we're excited to start this process with those countries. We've done a lot of past work through our SDG data hubs and other efforts to understand the problem, and now we have a good body of work and knowledge to take forward as a piece of wisdom and experience.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, looking forward to following that effort. We are really out of time here, but I do want to just give you a quick moment for any final thoughts, calls to action. You know, anyone tuning into this webinar obviously cares about this issue. So what can they do to ensure that moving forward and looking back, you know, geospatial data really does help to deliver on the goals of SDG 10?
Thanks. Yes. So I would just urge everybody to embrace geography and the great opportunity we have to use our geographic knowledge to improve our world. I would urge everybody to take a look at alliance.sdg.org, be a part of this work. We encourage everyone to engage and be part of this process. It's an inclusive process, and we're all working together to get to the same place. Thank you, Catherine, for having me.
Thank you. Really appreciate your time. And now we are joined by panelists who can expand on some of those themes that Charles discussed, using geospatial data to tackle inequalities and closing the geospatial digital divide. I'd like to introduce Kate Brown, Executive Director of the Global Island Partnership, which is a platform that enables island leaders and their supporters to take action to build resilient and sustainable island communities. Diana Washira, Program Officer at Pomodoro Trust, which is focused on access to land, shelter, and basic services for the urban poor in Kenya. And Amy Kokenauer Betancourt, CEO of the Cadasta Foundation, which uses innovative technology, services, and advocacy to advance global land and resource rights. Thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today. So first, I just want to better understand, I provided a bit of a preview of the mission and mandate of your organizations, but I'd love to hear a bit more about how your organizations are using geospatial tools and build that connection with SDG 10 for us. So Kate, can we start with you?
Yes, thanks, Catherine. So in the Global Island Partnership, we're actually the co-secretariat of another network called Local 2030 Islands Network, which is focused on local implementation of the SDGs in Ireland. So we want to make sure that islands can actually engage in, obviously, this critical issue of across the world. And one of the 4 principles of that network that members who join, and when I'm talking about islands, I'm talking about subnational islands like Hawaii or Guam or Puerto Rico, or island states like Ireland, or small island developing states that are islands like Palau or the Federated States of Micronesia. And when they join our network, they actually agree that one of the things they will do is develop their own locally and culturally appropriate SDG kind of sustainability goals, and that they will track those using a dashboard or similar tool. And so we actually have in that network an MOU with Esri and with our Hawaii Green Growth Local 2030 Hub, which is our member and co-secretariat in Hawaii, on helping islands to create these data or dashboards or similar entities. So it's very much driven by islands themselves. At the recent COP, we had a number of islands join the network, and we're really getting ready to look at what are the applications and tools that we can use that help advance this. All of the islands joining want to develop their own dashboard. They want to be able to understand both where are the gaps, where are they actually achieving things, and how does everyone in that island actually engage in that. And I think the dashboard is a really important tool, but the process for developing the indicators for that dashboard is really where you start to see SDG 10 in action, because it's that process of community engagement and making sure that no one is not part of that conversation. And I think we're right at the start of this. We've been about 2 years in, but we're expecting to see a lot of islands start to develop their own ability to measure progress and bring everyone around the table.
That's great. Thank you, Kate. And I hope we can hear a little bit more about what that community engagement process looks like, but we'll return to that. Thank you for that preview, though. So I'd love to bring Diana into this and hear a little bit more about your organization, and when it comes to your focus on the urban poor in Kenya, how does geospatial data play into that work?
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. So Pomodoro Trust has been in existence for about 20 years now, and the core of our work has been focused a lot on the urban poor. So our target population has been urban poor within informal settlements in Nairobi and other cities within the country. So what we have focused on really has been on building and developing and formulating different models that promote or bridge the gap that exists between the urban poor and the rest of the city. So some of these excluding factors that manifest are some of the issues that we really tackle with. So I'd say maybe in terms of how our communities use the geospatial data is to really make themselves visible. In terms of bridging this gap that excludes them from the city, the data processes and the geospatial technology, makes them visible, makes them be counted, they are seen and they have a voice. So these tools really amplify their voice, and they help them claim their space. I think as we continue sharing on within the session, I'll be able to share different experiences on how geospatial tools have helped the urban poor claim their space within the city. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Diana. We'll return to some of those examples, absolutely. Amy, I'm familiar with Cadasta Foundation. In fact, I know you and I have spoken before about some of these topics, but I wonder if you can share for our audience a little bit more about how geospatial data plays into your work.
Definitely. Thanks, Catherine. It's nice to be here. Really appreciate it. So Cadasta is a leading global land technology and services platform. And we really focus on tools and geospatial technologies that empower vulnerable communities to affordably and easily document, map, and secure inclusive land and resource rights at scale. So what the population that we're dealing with is this global population of vulnerable communities in which their land and resource rights are not recorded, generally not registered anywhere, meaning that they don't have any kind of formal recognition of the land and the resources on which they live and that they use for livelihoods. And so this is a huge failure of a public good, so to speak. And so Cadasta was really created to address the gap between these sort of top-down land administration systems that haven't been able to reach these communities with land services to formalize rights, and also the gap around land data. Even the best land administration systems need ground level data from these communities, and that data doesn't usually exist. And then also just the limited access of community organizations and civil society groups and even local governments to technologies that can help them map, document, manage, analyze, and share data. So the way that we engage with these types of technologies in our work is we are really building out the capacity of local organizations and local stakeholders from the bottom up to use geospatial technologies using mobile data collection tools, mapping tools, and web-based platforms to bring document it, sometimes for the very first time. And then also Cadasta is very focused on not just data collection, but engaging communities and building capacity to use the data. That is really key. How do we help communities be empowered to use their own data to not only manage land and secure tenure, but also to use data for things like community planning, for creating forest land use plans, or for planning urban infrastructure with local authorities. So we're really engaging communities around their own data and accessing it and using it to advance their own development objectives.
Thanks, Amy. And for me, your video has frozen there, so hopefully it'll come back up when we come back to you, but I heard you loud and clear, so no issues there. I want to dive into some specifics now from each of you. And you know, we're talking about the potential of geospatial data to make progress on SDG 10. But I want this audience to walk away with very real, concrete examples where they can tell a story, and Amy, we see you now, where they can tell a story about, oh, you know, Kate shared this example, Amy shared this example, Diana shared this example. So let's hear some examples of what this really looks like. I want to come to Kate first, because Kate, you mentioned community engagement, which we hear a lot when we talk about geospatial data, but would love for you to zoom in on a particular island you're working with where community engagement is part of the work when it comes to geospatial data, and help us really paint a picture of what using geospatial data to make progress on SDG 10 actually looks like in an island context.
Great. Yeah, I think the key is that it's island driven. It's driven by people in that island. It's not someone kind of parachuting in to tell people how to fix inequality or develop sustainability goals at the global level. And one of the things that islands are doing, and there's two that have really gone a long way down this track, is creating some type of entity, whether it's a public-private partnership or something that's not the government, whose role is to facilitate the process. So it's the process facilitation really critical, and their role is also to manage the data. which is in the case of Hawaii actually expressed on the governor of Hawaii's website, but the management of the data and the development, etc., is done by a public-private partnership. So you see there's a very strong relationship there. And then there, in the case of Hawaii and also in the case of Guam, which have developed, gone through this process of developing goals, and which I'll call relatively high capacity islands versus some of the other islands that we work with. And that, is also part of SDG 10, but they have gone through a consultation process to develop the goals that are critical for people in Hawaii. What are the sustainability goals that are relevant to Hawaii versus kind of all of everything coming from New York, and then developing sets of indicators through. That process took 3 to 4 years. It's not, you can't do those things quickly if you want actually to consult people, and you start to see the gaps in implementation and where things are not happening. So in other islands, for example, in some of the small island developing states, which have extremely limited capacity, also lack data. They lack, part of this is looking at where is data right now, who has data that can kind of support that. We're working actually closely with some big US government agencies to kind of help with some backstopping on the data side of things. But islands in particular are extremely good at running these types of processes. Partly it's because somewhere like Palau is only 20,000 people. It can be easier, but it can also be much more difficult because these are, you can't escape from the things that you're doing. If you're making data available, you live in the same place with the people that can see that. So you've kind of got to take a huge responsibility. And then there's also some islands where there's really complex issues around people that are not documented in those spaces. And so how do you make sure that they are kind of counted in this process? And so these are all things we very much, this network is learning from each other. So trialing things and then figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and adopting it and continuing to iterate the process. So we have sort of a guideline, and we're developing a community of practice on data and dashboards, largely so that it can continue to be island driven. That is a really clear message from the islands that we work with. There's enough development support that's coming in that isn't necessarily driven by the islands themselves. And these are critical issues, I think, for islands, particularly if you connect it to the COP in Glasgow and the just real underrepresentation of an island voice in the COP, I think that also points to the problem of the digital divide, particularly for the Pacific, which is in many places left behind. So all of these issues become more obvious, and then we start to work together to figure out how to address them.
Thank you. And I love your point that islands are sharing learnings with one another of what works and what doesn't work. So I hope when we delve a little further into the geospatial digital divide, we can talk about some of the learnings that are being shared. But Diana, I want to go to you, and part of why I'm so glad to have your perspective on this panel is SDG 10 is focused on inequalities within and between countries. And in your focus, in your work in Kenya, you're very much focused, I would say, on inequality within a country context. So can you take us through, what does that look like? I mean, you see this day in and day out, but for those of us who don't, what does that inequality look like? And can you give us a specific example of how geospatial data is moving the needle?
Thank you, Catherine, and also thank you, Kate, for that, quite informative. So in terms of how inequality manifests within Kenya, and especially within the informal areas, is that for a long time, there has been a lack of government focus or government really concern over the presence of informal settlements in Kenya. So in terms of planning, in terms of access to infrastructure, in terms of access to services, participation in decision-making, for a long time, residents from informal settlements were not really being seen. And that gave away or paved way for a lot of evictions in these informal settlements. I think, as we all know, evictions are one of the key factors that really intensify the inequalities, especially in the context of informal areas. It's one of the factors that really makes these already vulnerable communities even much more vulnerable. So in terms of the urban context, you find a lot of inequalities manifesting in that way. So then such communities are often left to fend for themselves in terms of access to every other service that residents in more formal areas have access to. So, and I think in terms of the work that we do in relation to this geospatial technology and tools has been really to deal with the issue of forced evictions and what that means, or what it implies in terms of how it affects these already vulnerable populations. And one of the key examples that comes to mind is on an eviction that happened last year in 2020. And this eviction was targeted at a community, an informal village in Nairobi. Now, the most upsetting thing about this eviction was that it was right in the middle of our first lockdown. It was actually a few weeks into the first time our country went into lockdown. So at a point where communities and we were all supposed to stay at home, homes were destroyed. So it was really a devastating kind of situation. And to add on to this was that there was a planned rollout of more land repossession exercises that would affect 6 more informal settlements, really bringing about a more devastating damage and more devastating dispossession of homes. So then what we did in terms of using this kind of data and tools and technology is that we engaged Cadasta. And based on their expertise and based on the experiences on these geospatial technologies and tools, we were able to actually get information on these other targeted areas, map them out, do analysis, that is proximity analysis, looking at what if this eviction takes place at this point, this is the scope of people that will be affected. We're also able to use, Facebook data to actually estimate the populations that would be affected within that situation. And once this information was put together, it was really astounding. It was mind blowing, the kind of impacts, the kind of loss of home, the kind of loss of property that these evictions would result to, and that caught the attention of everybody. It caught the attention of non-governmental agencies, it caught the attention of governmental agencies, and it got the attention of communities. So, and by communities, I mean both those who are going to be affected and also those that we normally engage with. So that kind of evidence-based kind of approach, because you can actually see the scope of destruction. That kind of approach really brought a lot of people or created a conversation. And I think that is one of the key aspects or really the importance of taking into account the geospatial technology and tools to change the situation or to bridge this gap in terms of the inequalities. So it really started a conversation that, this you can actually see the kind of damage that will happen in the case these evictions take place. And so we used that information to really have a strong advocacy strategies. We were able to invite different players into conversations, and we are able to really push for different approaches in terms of putting an end or a stop to the planned evictions. And so the evictions were stopped. So about 70,000 people were able to actually have their homes. And even though I think this kind of process was we only were able to do it within that scope, I think it really gives a lot of hope and a lot of confidence in informal settlements in reclaiming their spaces or claiming their rights to the spaces that they own. So that was one exemplary example of the power and the possibilities that geospatial technologies provide, especially in terms of dealing with inequalities at that urban informal context.
Thank you. That's so helpful. Oh, sorry about that. I heard myself echo there. But when you were talking about claiming rights to their space. That's a very vivid example of what that really looks like in practice. So thank you for that. And I actually wasn't familiar with the fact that Pomodoro Trust and Cadasta Foundation work together in this way. So it's great to have both of you here to discuss a really interesting partnership in this space. Amy, would love to go to you next. And actually, in addition to hearing some specific examples from you, the one Diana shared being one of them, I'd love to better understand to how much of your portfolio of projects around the world come together in this way, where a group like Pomodoro Trust is reaching out saying, here's the challenge we're facing, how can you help?
Yeah, I'm glad, Diana, I'm glad you shared that story, because I think that is a great example of what we mean by data empowerment, and also how Cadasta works with local organizations like Pomodoro Trust to do this work. And that's what our objective is try to strengthen the capacity and the community empowerment around these issues. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I also wanted to say that Esri is actually going to be publishing a blog about this very case study of this very case, and it should be coming out very soon. So keep an eye out for that. They did a really excellent write-up of this story, and talked about what the outcome was basically stopping 70,000 people from getting evicted. Yeah, so Cadasta works in 38 countries. We have about over 5.5 million people's rights documented on our platform. And the way that we're able to do that is through our over 85 partners on the ground. And Pomodoro Trust is one of them. And we work through partnerships because, number one, it's the way that we want to work. We want to support local organizations. We want to build their capacity. We don't want to replicate ourselves anywhere. We're just trying to provide that technical support and training, but also because that's the way that we can scale our work. We can only scale through others. The local organizations on the ground are trusted intermediaries and are members of the communities themselves. And so they are the legitimate actors and stakeholders in this space. So that's what we try to do. And it's interesting, there's just a couple of other examples. We worked with a partner in Brazil and the Brazilian Amazon, and it was during COVID, and they used Cadasta's platform to document the relationship between the land and the landholders. These are homesteads or farms that hadn't never been documented before, but they also did a lot of surveys around COVID, how COVID was impacting livelihoods, and a whole other range of questions to try to get at what was going on in the ground. But one of the interesting pieces of that was, as they were gathering all this data from several cooperatives and other community organizations and landholders, there was a dashboard that was created to kind of show land ownership. And on this dashboard was a statistic that showed that there were way fewer women who owned the land than men, and that the women's land holdings were much smaller than the men's. And so when the community saw that data point and clicked on the dashboard and saw that, it immediately started a conversation about, well, wait a minute, why do women have why are they not only very less often landholders, but why is their land so much smaller than the men? And it just kind of started that whole conversation. And that's what we mean when we talk about empowering people around data, because they can start to make decisions. They start to understand the world around them in a different way. Another example is in a project in India that we work with a local organization called Pradhan, and it is mapping and documenting forest rights. There has been a law in India since 2006, the Forest Rights Act, that enabled local communities, tribals and indigenous communities to claim forest land. And but very little has been done to implement that. And one of the reasons for that is it is an onerous sort of bureaucratic process, but part of the inability to really implement was this ability to collect data at scale using tools that weren't paper-based, or being able to survey a large number of households and collect the geospatial information. And so as a result of partnerships with Pradhan and with a lot of other Indian partners that we're working with, we have been able to, they have been able to document and process those forest rights claims through all the different steps of government, starting from the very local governance body, all the way through the revenue office, the forest office, there's a lot of steps along the way. So that has been starting to scale as a result of the technology. And we actually did an impact evaluation. We had a third-party impact evaluation of the work to ask the community landholders what kind of impact this had on their quality of life. And the data that came back showed that in these landholder interviews, that 87% of them said that they had an improved quality of life after the land documentation than before. And the additional data point that was interesting was we collect data in the beginning about how secure people feel on their land. The perception of tenure security is a question, for example, how worried are you that you will lose your land in 5 years? How likely is it that you will lose your land in 5 years? And so it just gives you a sense of how insecure or secure people feel. And in this particular case, 75% of the landholders interviewed said they were worried or slightly worried about losing their land in the next 5 years. That was before the land was documented. After the land was documented, they were interviewed and they said it was the other way around. 75% of the respondents said they were less worried about losing their land now that they have this land documentation. So that is a direct impact on local people, and that has a huge impact on the community in terms of livelihoods and their willingness to invest in land, invest in conservation, invest in other businesses on the land. So this idea of empowering communities can be done at the community level, like Diana talked about, and the Brazil example, or it can be at the household level where landowners are making different decisions as a result of really understanding how data and how this sort of documentation impacts their lives.
Those are some really powerful examples. So we've all talked about how geospatial data can be used to make progress on SDG 10, to tackle inequality within and between countries. But as we've alluded to, and I want to talk a little bit more in depth about this now, access to these tools, capacity to use these tools is not evenly distributed throughout the world and within and between countries. So Kate, I'd love to start with you on this question, because you were mentioning this in the Pacific Islands, for example, that there are major barriers that stand in the way of these tools really being used and applied and realizing their full potential to make progress on SDG 10. So what are some of those barriers, and what progress is being made to ensure that more places can use these tools because of some of the huge potential we've heard about from you and Amy and Diana?
Thanks for that. And I just wanted to really say from Diana and Amy, I love data empowerment and scale through others. I think those are really great concepts, and obviously things that we're trying to apply as well. Well, you know, it's really interesting when you talk about kind of the digital divide. So because we ran last year a series of webinars for half the year and really experienced some government people in some of the islands actually have to go into their office at work to call into things because there's no internet access kind of outside of the office. And this is some big countries like Papua New Guinea, for example. And even with that, she could not be on camera. Like that's for a webinar, which isn't a huge lift. And then even recently with another island where one of our staff is based, someone else from a US said, I now realize what you're talking about, because he, even in his island, could not consistently be on camera. It just kept kind of dropping off. And he kept having to call back into the webinar in which he was the moderator and was trying to use a good space. So those are kind of in webinar space, we're having this trouble. When we get into the use of dashboards, I think particularly in some of the SIDS, this is where we're going to have to look at kind of different ways to support them. I think the biggest effort that's underway right now is to try and engage and digitize the Pacific, including cables and etc. So those are things not within our ability to do something about, but I know that that's underway because that is a problem. You definitely saw if most of your region cannot actually participate in person in a meeting like the COP, and then they also cannot call in, this is a real problem. So I think post-COP and during this COVID period, we'll start to see hopefully an acceleration. I know there's a lot of donors working on that. And it's not just enabling that at the town area. And I think Amy and Diane will know what I'm talking about there. It's enabling people in remote island communities who are really difficult to contact to be part of this process. And there's been a big change, I think, even in the time I've been working in islands. The penetration of mobile phones, for example, and mobile technology has been a huge thing. So it's really going to be about thinking, how do we make things that work with where people are now? And they're all in various spaces. So some are highly developed and some are least developed countries. And making sure that we also, as we start doing things, don't leave people behind. Like we can be equally guilty because it's really difficult. We've been, I think, really trying to articulate that, the issue on the digital divide in a lot of conversations that we've been having, including with places like UNESCO and some of the donors to those things who can actually do something about these issues. But it will continue to be a problem. It will continue until we have some type of technology that's easily accessible. And I believe that can happen. I mean, when I first started working, for example, in the Pacific, it was impossible to, I mean, a lot of things were done with letters sent. And now we can kind of have webinars with people and etc. I mean, but the problem is that it's not everyone. Everyone is not able to access things evenly. That's also a problem even where I live in New Zealand. And we haven't solved it here either. So I think as technology advances, we'll start to see that. But what we also see is we need to have the solution that is right for that location and that place. And the only way we can do that is by enabling those people to be part of that conversation. And so, a lot of the reason why islands are really interested in this geospatial technology space and dashboards is because they want to better coordinate support that's coming into their island through something that has been developed through a bottom-up process. There's lots of strategies, there's lots of plans, there's NDCs, for example, MBs, there's so many. How does that make sense? What is the process for engaging people in those? And how do you implement it and understand how implementation is happening across the diversity of spaces that it touches upon? And I think what has been really interesting, for example, in Hawaii, which started as a green growth focused commitment, that in their dashboard, they're tracking things like affordable housing, because that's a major issue. Indigenous and local communities in Hawaii are being left behind as housing prices are really crazy. Same problem here where I live. It's really difficult for local people to get housing because of this issue. So we need to kind of track where that's happening and then understand how it fits and what some of the solutions might be. to that. And I think the first step in that is really understanding what the problem is and what progress is being made. And that's really where the benefit of a dashboard comes in.
Diana, Amy, I want to give either of you or both of you the opportunity to quickly jump in here in terms of barriers that stand in the way of these tools being used to their full potential. Amy, did you want to jump in first?
Yeah, I'll jump in and say, when we start to work with a partner on the ground, one of the first things we do is assess where they are in terms of access, technology, connectivity, because we can set up offline workflows in low connected environments. And so we have to create data models around that, and we have to configure workflows to accommodate that. And so, you know, it was a bit of an experiment for Cadasta to use an enterprise level technology like Esri in these environments and bring it down to the community level. And what we've seen is if we take the time up front to really understand the needs and figure that out, we can make it happen. And also the other piece there that I'd like to add is, you know, we're out there working with community data collectors from very low resource, you know, folks with low education levels, very limited access to technology. And you know, it's just so gratifying and wonderful to see how we can bring digital literacy to these communities in ways that they haven't had before. And we're not recreating the wheel around community participation. Those processes have been there forever, engaging people, making sure women are trained and involved. But what we're doing is saying, okay, look, let's take your community participatory process and let's figure out how to bring technology into the mix so that the data that you collect and your data can be used and updated and shared in ways that you haven't been able to do before. And so we really have to look at, you know, how to come in and work with what we've got and bring people to the next level.
Diana, quickly, do you want to jump in on this question around ensuring these tools are used to their full potential and tackling the barriers that will allow us to close this geospatial digital divide?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm in total agreement with Amy and Kate in terms of these barriers to using geospatial technology, talking about access, talking about capacity, talking about costs. You know, these are some of the things that really manifest as a key challenges, especially within the context of where we work, and that is the informal settlements. And it really makes this kind of introduction of new technology also a bit hard because of these kinds of aspects. But what I'd say is that in terms of what is happening within community processes is that you'd find the communities that already take initiative, you know, to document themselves, to put their data together, but they do this using the more so traditional ways, the more so traditional means. I think in terms of really bridging this gap or bridging this divide, we can, or governments or partners, you know, people can really see how do you meet halfway, you know, so that whatever is already ongoing within community spaces can already be taken up, so that then, as Amy said, it's something that really gets into whatever is already happening. That's something that gets into already existing community processes. I think that will really go a long way in bridging that divide.
Thanks, Diana. Well, we have just a couple minutes left. So this is a big question, but I do hope to quickly hear from each of you with a final thought. How can we make sure that in 2030, when we look back on progress we've made in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and we look at SDG 10 in particular, how do we make sure that geospatial data is a part of what is hopefully a success story? So, I mean, we have a lot of progress that has yet to be made. 2030 is right around the corner, but what's just a final point you want to reiterate or call to action to ensure that geospatial data really lives up to its potential to deliver on SDG 10 by 2030? So very quickly, we'll start with Kate, and then we'll go to Amy and Diana.
Yes, I think that's such a great question. And my quick thought is to continue doing things like this where people are learning from each other about kind of the approaches and the ways that we can accelerate change. Once we start working in our own silos, I think we don't get as far. It's this coming together. And I think that's why the SDG Data Hubs initiative and all of those other global initiatives are really important. But the real kind of implementation, the implementers also need to kind of learn from each other and continue to innovate, because innovation happens at all levels. And I think that's my suggestion, is to figure out ways for this innovation to continue to happen.
Thank you, Kate. Amy, we'll go to you.
There's been a lot of effort to build out the geospatial infrastructure at the national level, and it is very important to do that. But those in that geospatial infrastructure, and it's not going to mean anything if there's no data coming in from the ground level. And so my call to action is for donors and other stakeholders who are going to be investing, for example, in indigenous local communities and these efforts toward climate action, that it's not just about funding from the top down, it's also investing resources in communities and the stakeholders around these local communities to bring data in to the process and be able to report up from the ground level. So we've got to be empowering, in short, data empowerment and engagement at the community level.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amy. Diana, any final thoughts?
Thank you. I think in addition to what Amy and Kate have shared, I think for me, my call to action will be more of deliberate, consistent efforts by national and county level government agencies to really push for the uptake of digital technology and use of geospatial technology at that level. So then it makes it easier to even incorporate what is happening at the community level. So then there's that linkage with community processes. And I think that will really give boost to what is already happening at the local level, especially within the context of Kenya. So that's deliberate uptake at the top, and really also in terms of also supporting resources for the same. So then, and that would really, in my opinion, complement what is already existing and what is already happening at the local level.
All great points. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us for this conversation. Thank you to Esri for partnering with Devex on this series, ensuring progress on the SDGs through geospatial thinking and GIS technology. And thank you to all of you for joining this conversation.